From Heterodox Academy, this is Half Hour of Heterodoxy. Conversations with scholars and authors, ideas from diverse viewpoints and perspectives. Here's your host, Chris Martin.
Kevin Kruse and Julian Zelizer appeared at the AJC Decatur Book Festival this year to talk about Fault Lines, a history of the United States since 1974. This is a recording of that session. I was the moderator. It was recorded on September 1st, 2019 at the First Baptist Church of Decatur.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for that introduction. And thank you all for coming today. As Deborah mentioned, I'm affiliated with Georgia Tech. I also host a podcast called Half Hour of Heterodoxy. Both Kevin and Julian have been on that podcast. Kevin's episode was shortly after New Year's Day, and Julian's episode was shortly after Valentine's Day. Both of you probably know this already about their background, but they're both historians at Princeton University. This is Kevin's second visit to the book festival. He spoke here about 10 years ago about his first major book, White Flight, Atlanta and the Making of Modern Conservatism. He's also the author of One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America, which was published in 2015. This is Julian's first visit here. He's the author of 5 previous books, including a 2010 book about Jimmy Carter, named by the Washington Post, one of the best presidential biographies, and a 2015 book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. His next book, which we'll touch on, is about Newt Gingrich. Now, to begin, I'd like to talk about...
Coming soon.
Okay. Yes. So to begin, this book is based on a course that's taught at Princeton University. It's a modified version of an older course that covered the middle of the 20th century. So Kevin and Julian updated the syllabus and changed it into a course about the last 40 years. And I thought we'd talk about the Cold War because that's one of the most important events of this era. The end of the Cold War is important, but you're teaching undergraduates who were born sometimes 10 years after the Cold War ended. How do you convey the seriousness of the Cold War and how influential it was in shaping our politics?
It's difficult, and it's funny for many people in the room. It's obvious what the Cold War was, and for the purposes of our course and the book, what it meant when the Cold War started to come to an end in the late 80s and it really ends by the early 90s. And it's difficult. And so in the course itself, part of what we do is we have a lot of video and audio, not just to flourish the lectures, but to actually try to show through images of the wall falling or coverage of Reagan's negotiations with Gorbachev, or showing and talking about conservatives attacking Reagan for simply having these kind of diplomatic interactions, the magnitude of what this event was. A little earlier in the 80s, we write a lot in the book, and the course covers the nuclear freeze movement to try to really talk about, in the early 80s, the real fear that existed that nuclear war was possible and just how heated events had become. So we try many different techniques, and in the book we paid great attention to that. And part of what we argue is, in the end, it doesn't reshape politics here as much as you'd think, but we're cognizant of the need to bring back what that war meant.
Beautifully said.
And another shocking thing for many undergraduates is the parties overlapped ideologically. So you couldn't, if you randomly picked a Democratic politician or a Republican politician, you didn't necessarily pick a liberal or a conservative. How do you convey that overlap and the change from that era to the present when you're talking about this?
Well, that's really something. So you mentioned this course. I'll back up a second. This course was one that I inherited when I started at Princeton in 2000, and it was a course that I think had been designed in 1960, and it was titled U.S. Since 1920. And well, as you might know, some stuff happened after 1960. And I had inherited this course that kept getting bigger and bigger and more crowded and more crowded. And when Julian joined the faculty a few years after me, we talked about we would finally cut it up. And so this post-74 class became one that we co-taught together, and the book came out of that. But Julian runs that on his own now, and I have I did the 1920 to 1974 part. And it's in that course that I really dig into that issue of the overlapping ideologies of the parties. And you're right, it is something that students, and I think maybe many people in the general public, take for granted, that of course Republicans are all conservative, maybe towards the center, Democrats are liberal, maybe towards the center, but there's a clear ideological sorting. And of course that's not the way it was for most of the 20th century. I think today when people look back for that bipartisan age, they forget that they had to be bipartisan back then. If you were a liberal, you had to find the liberal votes in your party and the liberal votes in the other party. If you were a conservative, you had to find them in your party and the other party. That's how things got done. And so the sorting has moved a lot of that natural need for bipartisanship out of the process. But the way to really to do that and talk about that is to bring some of these past figures to life, to show them, yes, there were liberal Republicans in the 60s. Yes, there were, Southern Democrats were conservatives. To really bring these figures to life and to show how that sorting out started from the 60s on.
And it takes time and for writing to younger audiences, but also more mature audiences. We really forget how this evolution happened from the 1960s. And I mean, that's been part of our mission. And back to I'm going to think back to the Cold War question. My first job was at SUNY Albany, and I'll never forget, I had a huge lecture on the U.S. since the 30s. And I taught this great lecture, I thought, on the Cold War. And I had all these things I learned as a graduate student. I gave this, multi-point lecture with lots of examples about the Cold War. Finished, was walking out. And one student nicely said, "Professor, can I ask you a question?" She's like, "What's the Cold War?" And I think... And that always stuck with me, and it stuck with me as we wrote this book, whether it's about the end of the Cold War, whether it's about how divided parties became pretty internally united. That part of what we're trying to do with the book is recapture things we assume we understand, but actually were more dynamic, complex, and contested since the 1970s than we remember.
Right. I actually moved to America in 1995, and I remember when I moved here, a friend of mine tried to explain the difference between the parties to me, and it was actually a complex discussion, which it would not be that complex right now.
Well, Newt Gingrich he replaced John Flint, who some of you might remember, who was a Southern Democrat of a very different variety than most current Democrats. And Gingrich was one of the people who understood the new possibilities, partisan possibilities that were unfolding in areas of the country like the South.
So one of the people featured on the cover of your book is Phyllis Schlafly. The peak of her influence was in the 1970s, so she's another figure that younger Americans might not be that familiar with, yet she was perhaps as influential as some presidents. Can you talk about her influence and why she's such an interesting figure?
Yeah, Schlafly is really a fascinating figure for us, in that she really was a motivator for movement conservatism, and really probably embodied better than anyone else the family values politics that rise up in the 1970s. And she's a fascinating figure because her life story is one in which it seems like a feminist success story. She is a lawyer, a mover, a shaker in Republican Party politics, overshadows her husband in a lot of ways. But her politics are decidedly anti-feminist. And so she leads the campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment. And when the Equal Rights Amendment came out of Congress in 1972, it seemed like it was going to automatically pass. 5 states ratify it within the first day that it comes out of the House. And it seems like it's going to be a quick road to ratification until Schlafly organizes forces on the other side. And it was an amazing job that she did, whether you agree with her politics or not. What she did was really remarkable because she took this thing that on the surface seemed obvious to everyone would be in favor of equal rights for women. Why not? What Schlafly does is she argues that this isn't about equal rights for women. It's going to destroy the family. It's going to remove women's automatic right to custody or alimony in case of divorce. It's going to remove the right that their husbands will take care of them. It's going to give children rights to speak out against their parents. So it's really going to break up the American family. And she's a master of retail politics. And in an era where I think far too many Americans think of politics as something that happens at the White House and Congress. She knew that a lot of the real work is done at state legislatures. And so they lobbied these states to fight against the ERA, and in ways that may seem corny, but were incredibly effective. They baked goods and bread and muffins, and they sent them to these legislators. They would show up in their nice floral dresses, and they would present them this plate of baked goods. My heart and hands went into this dough for the sake of the family. Please vote no. And these little but it worked. And they lobbied these states, and they stopped the ERA dead in its tracks. And even with an extension, Congress extended the deadline 5 more years to get ratified up to 82. They still stopped it dead. So it's a remarkable a work of kind of retail politics at the state level, of taking on something that everyone assumed would succeed. She brought it down with her forces.
And she's really an important figure for us in that early part of the book, in that we're kind of challenging 2 claims about the post-60s. One is that there was this inevitable shift to conservatism. It just happened. The country was sick of the 60s. 68 was a big mess, and the country moved right. Or the argument that Ronald Reagan was simply this pioneering candidate who was able to introduce the country to a new conservative age. And we really try to bring together a lot of the great work in history and show this was a very powerful, sophisticated conservative movement that operated on many levels in transforming these ideas into political power, into public debate, whether it was her for the kind of organizing that Kevin is talking about, or different fundraising and media entrepreneurs. We try to really capture the magnitude of the conservative movement in understanding why you see this change in the Republican Party and why the politics shifts, even though a lot of liberalism, liberal ideas, liberal policies remain very popular and were very enduring even in this period.
And 2 Georgians are featured here, Newt Gingrich and Jimmy Carter, both of whom entered Washington as outsiders. Newt Gingrich, however, was able to create a sustained career in Washington. So talk about his personality as well as the structures around him that made all of his work possible.
I'll just give a quick one on this because I'm happy to come back. But no, Gingrich, I'm arguing, and we argue a little bit in the book, was he was an important entrepreneur, and he understood the way in which a lot of the institutions and the political establishment of the 50s and 60s had become quite fragile as a result of Vietnam, as a result of the conservative movement, and he exploited that. His personality is brash. It's aggressive, it's in your face, and he really promoted the idea among Republicans that civility should be thrown out the window. There's no need to respect norms and institutions, and that if the Republican Party was going to remake itself, the way it was going to do that was by tearing everything down. And Gingrich's career before becoming Speaker, which is what I'm certainly interested in, is about finding ways to exploit new developments out of the 60s, cable television, ethics rules, and use them as a partisan cudgel. And he does it really well, and it culminates with him becoming Speaker. The speakership doesn't last, as in any Shakespearean story. His strengths become his weaknesses. But for that period, he's a key person in making the Republican Party that we know today. And then Carter, you want to touch on Carter?
Yeah, well, you've written a book on both these guys, but I'll take Carter. Carter really does. Carter sets in motion one of the things we talk about with Carter. Well, there are a lot we talk about in the book, but I think one of the most important ones that you mentioned is Carter really starts to set the model for the outsider. Right? Carter runs against the mess in Washington. Right? Post Watergate, he's a one-term Georgia governor. He seems to be honest, straightforward. He teaches Sunday school in a Baptist church in Plains, Georgia. He's a peanut farmer, runs a warehouse, talking to reporters in blue jeans, right? Seems like somebody who's far removed from politics. And so he's the outsider. Well, he comes in, he becomes the insider. Ronald Reagan, governor of California, runs as the outsider. You get a series of people running more and more from the outside to the point that now we've got businessmen and the current president who had never run for anything significant before. That's the total outsider. And so it starts this politics in which the previous era had been marked by insiders, and having decades of experience was what you needed. Lyndon Johnson had been a member of the House from the 30s, Senate Majority Leader in the 50s, Vice President. That was, the resume you needed to build to be president. And then we suddenly enter a world today in which the less you know, the better. Which is a kind of a remarkable, and I'm not sure that has been borne out with recent events, but it really is a remarkable shift, and one I think that Carter really does a lot to accelerate.
And both of them are there is a similarity between, not commonality, not a similarity. Both are exploiting the state of American institutions in the 70s, which is an important decade, we argue, in just how many things had weakened, and whether it's how changes to the party nomination process had changed the way we pick presidents, to the way Congress had really been rocked by internal reform as a result of Vietnam and Watergate. The institutions were ready to be exploited by people who were not from them. And both are totally different people, as you all know. But they're both kind of using that outsider image. They're both willing to challenge pretty conventional ideas within their own parties. And they both go very far in different ways as a result of the state of the country in the 1970s. So for figures who are very far apart, I do think that's an important foundation on which they built their careers, which we try to talk about in our 70s chapters.
And another interesting thread in conservative politics from the 1940s to the present is the reaction to the New Deal. The New Deal is almost this character that doesn't die because so much of libertarian and conservative politics is a reaction to it. And yet you begin your book in 1974. So when you're teaching this course, do you take a detour and talk to students about what the New Deal was and why there's been the sustained effort to turn it back?
Well, yeah, we do it in the course and we do it in the book. 74 we picked as an important year. The President of the United States resigns, and today that kind of might be something we can't even remember as dramatic, but it really was, and so we thought that was a good point. It's a year where a lot of the tensions in the country are coming together, from the economic crisis to Vietnam is really coming to a conclusion, to the issues of the presidency, and so we use 74 as a great starting point. But we do move back and forth, and the New Deal is central. It set the terms of the debate, as did the Great Society, for what a lot of the period since the 70s is about. So we really do bring back the enormity of what government intervention did in both the 30s and the 1960s to understand what was at stake when this conservative movement said, let's dismantle. It wasn't just kind of paper-thin policies. These were pretty important interventions into the economy. And the ability to weaken those and sometimes dismantle some of the New Deal or Great Society, we argue, is part of why kind of the country ends up in the state that it does today.
And you cover in One Nation Under God how many Christian preachers in the 1950s also thought that self-sufficiency was a tenet of Christianity.
Right. Yeah. So there's a book I wrote called One Nation Under God, which was started out to be a study of the religious right in the 60s and 70s, and I kept pulling threads like an historian and kept moving back further and further in time. And what the evidence took me was a story that I didn't expect. I'd always been told that all of the religious trappings we take for granted today, One Nation Under God, in our Pledge of Allegiance, In God We Trust is the national motto, the national prayer breakfast, all these things, the prayer chapel on Capitol Hill, all these things that we take for granted today, they all came about in the 50s. The traditional story I'd gotten was that they were all part of a Cold War movement, and that we're fighting the godless communists, and therefore the country started to build up its own godly nature. But as I started to pull it, I found that this too was something that was a reaction to the New Deal, that this language of freedom under God starts not in the 50s, but in the 30s. And it's done not to oppose the fear of a communism coming from Moscow. It's this creeping socialism coming from the New Deal in Washington, D.C. that they're worried about. And so they kind of weaponize a new form of Christianity, which is wedded totally to capitalism, to fight the New Deal. So no matter where you move across the 20th century, the New Deal really is kind of a lodestone that's always there, always in the background.
And another thread through this period is media and the changes in the media, from the end of the fairness doctrine to the development of celebrity news reporters. Talk a bit about some of the unique features of the development of the media, and especially Fox News and its influence on American politics.
You want me to start? We'll keep going. Yeah, the media is something we've always, both of us, were interested in, even as we started the course. But as we wrote the book, it kind of turned into from an issue we discussed in different periods to a theme. And we try to, in the book, really cover just how fundamentally the news media has changed since the 1960s, where your starting point is 3 major networks on television that provide about 22 minutes of news every night without the commercials, and a handful of major city papers. 2, first, the creation of the 24-hour news cycle. And we talk about cable television, including CNN here in Atlanta, and how it fundamentally changes the structure of news delivery in terms of timing and a constant flow of information. Then we talk about the end of the fairness doctrine. So in addition to a 24-hour news cycle, you lose a government regulation in '87, which put pressure on both producers, editors, and hosts to provide both sides of every issue. And it opens the door to talk radio, a conservative talk radio, and then Fox in 1996, much more explicit political news in this 24-hour atmosphere. And all of this goes even more haywire with the social media world of the early 2000s, from Twitter to the internet and online reporting. And we try to cover just how that world has changed and how the platform through which we have our information actually facilitates, fosters, and favors the kind of divisiveness that we often lament. But there is a reason that you're getting that information that way. And one other thing is the commercial aspect of all of these kind of outlets is another key feature.
And the news arc is one that we kind of expected that we would find. And one thing that I think surprised us when we started researching was to see that the more entertainment sides of the media actually were informing news more and more. That may seem obvious today, but we found back in the 80s, CNN was an important story, but MTV actually was almost a more important model for what we were looking at, because MTV pioneers what they call narrowcasting. They say the networks are engaged in broadcasting. They're trying to reach a big, broad audience. What we're going to do is find a slice of that electorate, a slice of that viewership. And it's going to be, for us, it's going to be people who are into rock music, right? But other cable channels did the same thing and found a narrow niche in the market that they would go in and they would appeal to. And that's something that we see becomes more of a model, not just in terms of news networks, where you've got Fox News for conservatives, MSNBC for more liberal folks. You've got different channels all across cable for every variety of interest. And it certainly becomes amplified in the era of the internet, where you can find a web page for everything, and it's social media, where you can navigate your Facebook or Twitter feed for just people who think like you and already believe the same things as you and are going to say them back to you. So it becomes much more as we view this sweeping changes in the media from these 3. The mainstream media was a thing. These 3 broadcast networks, a few handful of big city newspapers, to an incredibly fractious landscape in which not only are there a million media choices, but now today everyone can be their own reporter. You've got a camera and a broadcast machine in your hand, and you can get out there. And now it's kind of a wide open landscape. And as a result of that, there are a million different opinions and a million different versions of what the facts are. And that's a radically different moment from where this story begins.
And you also talk about how some of the wealthiest Americans have influenced politics. You talk about the Scafee family and the Coors family, the Olin Foundation, and so forth. How do you think figures like that compare to figures today like the Koch brothers? What are the Koch brothers doing that's different from what was happening in the 70s?
Well, we do talk a lot about that, and this is really an important change. Again, another one that happens really in the 70s. In the wake of Watergate, there's a series of reforms that passed through Congress in order to try to clean up politics, and the money was one of the big things. I think these checks that had been paid to the Watergate burglars were campaign finance checks, and it was an effort to try to clean this up. The big change there, though, gets struck down by the Supreme Court and an often forgotten, but I think criminally overlooked Supreme Court decision called Buckley v. Vallejo. It's William F. Buckley's brother, James Buckley, who was a conservative senator out of New York, challenges this. And the upshot of the decision is that it strikes down a lot of the rules for that govern campaign finance, but it leaves in place an avenue for candidates to self-fund. And so suddenly there are no limits on what a millionaire or a billionaire can spend on their own political campaign, whereas ordinary people have all these rules hemming them in on what they can raise and how they can spend. And so it leads to more and more wealthy candidates. It also leads to an increased role for individuals, but also businesses to get involved in politics. And this radically skews the national conversation on matters of business, on matters of taxation, on matters of regulation, and it shifts things considerably. Now, the Koch brothers fit a larger pattern because another thing that happens in the 70s there are the rise of conservative think tanks. Olin, Scafee, Bradley are all funding these things. The rise of new PACs that are pushing these messages. You get things like the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute. All these groups really take off, the Cato Institute take off in the 70s. And that sets a model. And what the Koch brothers have done is to take that model, really, but their energies have been spent on a place that is often out of the national landscape. It's really been focused in on state legislatures. And they've done tremendous work there through groups like, and working with groups like ALEC, to really affect state legislatures and really change the laws of a state level where a lot of business actually happens.
Right. I mean, one interesting development now is think tanks becoming more openly partisan as well. They used to maintain a veneer of some respectability, but one shocking development this year is the Claremont Institute giving a fellowship to Jack Posobiec, who is responsible for spreading the Pizzagate conspiracy theory.
Right. I mean, but that too, like, there's all these points in the book where you see not the origin, but an origin point for changes that today we see in such a pronounced level. So what Kevin talked about is really important. And here's a Supreme Court case with Buckley versus Vallejo where the government opens the doors to a kind of money and politics relationship that gets bigger and it's transformed. But we were at a moment in the mid-1970s where it almost could have gone a different way. Congress pushed really sweeping campaign finance reforms, but they get checked in some ways. They get checked again later on when both parties in presidential races, by the time Obama's running, basically abandon public financing and open the doors. With the think tanks, in the 70s, you already see the shift you're talking about. And the new generation of conservative think tanks, they're very explicit that they're going to be more partisan and they're going to be more political. Brookings is their model of what not to do. They're competing for the marketplace. They believe, a lot of conservatives, that yes, Brookings is allegedly nonpartisan, they would argue, but it's still very liberal in its bias. So they're going to try to influence politics, and they start to produce their studies in a much more slick packaging. And they tend to be kind of bullet point presentations so that politicians like Ronald Reagan in 1980 and 81 will read what they have to say and use what they have to say. And this much more partisan world of think tanks is happening by the 70s and 80s. A lot of the groups Kevin talked about in the early part, Heritage, Cato, they're doing this already. And now we're just in an era where this is on steroids. And what we're seeing is an abandonment of pretense. It's the same thing you see in the media. There's been a lot of partisan news happening for a while now, but now, there's no more restraint. You can have hosts campaign with politicians. And I think that's a lot of what's been going on in the last few years and part of what we're trying to show with the book.
And this will be my last question, then we'll open it up for Q&A, and there'll be microphones up at the front. So my last question is about Chapter 2. You talk about crime and the crime wave in New York and many other cities in the 1970s, and that fits into this alternative move towards the suburbs. So Kevin, you've written about how the desire for segregated cities was a motive for the initial segregation. So does it become more complicated? Can you discern or distinguish between people who are moving away because of race and people who are moving away because of crime or moving away because of another reason?
It's very difficult, and it's hard to, you can't pinpoint one. Think about when you've moved. There was not maybe a job relocated you. That might have been a real motive. But if you moved within an area, there are multiple factors that would have gone into this. There are certain people that I talk about in White Flight who are very explicit that the reason they're moving is race, and this is the benefit of what I was writing about in the 50s and 60s was the city or reporters were asking these questions, and people either in these surveys or directly on the record to reporters would say straight up, yes, I'm moving because this neighborhood is going colored, they would say. And that was their reason. Or we're going to get out of the city. We don't want any of this integration mess. We're moving to the suburbs. They would say that on the record. So I can say, yes, those people were. You can't extrapolate from that to everyone, though, because not everyone who moved into the suburbs was fleeing the city of Atlanta. It was only about, I wrote this book way too long ago. I'll say about a quarter of the suburbs were white flight folks. But other people are coming in from other cities. But what's important is that when they get to those suburbs, whether they left the city for those reasons or they're just new to the region and that's the first place they settle down is in Marietta or Snellville or wherever, no matter what their origin story, they go into an environment where they don't want to have anything to do with the city, right? And so ultimately the motive doesn't matter. What happens is you get this new rise of a suburb that is really divorced from the central city and doesn't think of itself as part of Atlanta, rather thinks of itself as a place apart. And that's important, not just in terms of conceptually, but in terms of their politics, in terms of the policies that take place. Rejecting not just metropolitan solutions for integration like busing, but metropolitan solutions to public transit. I mean, the opposition to MARTA in places like Cobb and Gwinnett, it still goes on to this day, as you all know. But those in the 70s, there were very explicitly racial reasons behind that. Again, they're more complicated now than just that. But what it does is it seals those suburbs off from the city, and you get to very separate and unequal societies.
And we try, I think it's an important theme in the book in that we tell the history of race in some ways reflecting the shift in civil rights thought, meaning in the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of civil rights activists said, let's not only focus on intention when someone is being racist, as much as institutional racism. When our institutions, whether it's education, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's the structure of suburbs and schools and residential areas, perpetuates racial division or perpetuates racial injustice. And we try to catalog different ways that you see that since the 1970s, even after the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. And it's really in the last part of the book with the current president and some of the groups that have really come to the surface where we talk more, I'd say, about intentional racism as a political phenomenon. But we really try to pay a lot of attention to the history of post-1960s institutional racism as one of the one of the major problems of our era.
Great. Well, I'd love to ask you many more questions, but we need to move to questions and answers. So we will have at least one microphone. We'll have two microphones. Please phrase your question in the form of a question, not a life story. In other words, try to keep it to about 30 seconds or so. Go ahead.
When you got to Princeton, you inherited a course that was out of date and antiquated, dealing with a period from the 20s to the 60s. What happens to be the next touch point when someone inherits your course and looks back?
That's a great question. And I'll hand this off to Julian because that's going to be your decision to make.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know what the next touch point or breaking moment is. And I think if you were living in 1974, and many people in this room were, you wouldn't necessarily know as that year unfolded that was going to be a big breaking point. You wouldn't know if it was January that in August the president was going to be getting on a helicopter and saying, I quit, I'm out. And so I don't know if just because it's not apparent yet, it might be on the cusp. It won't be a decade break. It'll be an event which, in my mind, totally kind of culminates and manifests this divisive, raucous, contentious era that we're trying to transform. Some would say it's the 2016 election. There you go, start a new course. But I'm not sure we're there yet. I feel like something bigger is going to happen. I can't give you an answer. I can't prognosticate. But that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm looking for.
Great. I think global warming might also be an important theme in the next version of this course.
Then we won't be able to write about it. That's the problem.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes, in one of my undergraduate history courses, I remember talking about how change happens, and there were two theories. One is the Zeitgeist Theory, the spirit of the times, or the great person theory. And I've been to a number of talks this weekend, and I've heard lots of names. And today you mentioned Schlafly, Gingrich, Reagan, Koch brothers, the hosts of media programs. Which do you think is more responsible for the change that takes place? Great persons, or not so great persons, or the zeitgeist? And please don't say both.
I'm sorry, I'm an historian, and we are trained to say both. I do think the great, and again, just the questions in our conversation, the shorthand we have, we all know the great figures, so we think of them and they come up. But you can't understand them without understanding what goes on at the grassroots. Again, my own work I've really focused on grassroots conservatism in my first two books. I'm moving away from that with my new project, but you got to understand them in conversation. And maybe a way to think about this is Schlafly wasn't originally a great person. We know her now because of the grassroots work she did at state legislatures. Or think about one of the stories we chronicle in the book is the shift that happens on AIDS. At first, AIDS is something that is literally laughed at in the Reagan White House. A reporter asks the press secretary, and his reaction is, "Oh, I don't have AIDS. Do you have AIDS?" Ha ha ha. They joke it out of the room. It's not until 5 years into his presidency that Reagan even mentions AIDS. And it's something that is totally off the great man radar. And instead, local activists, through organizations like ACT UP, force it onto the national agenda. And they do so through dramatic protests in the streets, making this issue something that politicians can't ignore. Fast forward 15 years from that moment in 87 when Reagan finally acknowledges it, George W. Bush, another Republican who sees himself as Reagan's heir, pledges a massive amount of money to fight against AIDS on a global basis. It's I think his probably, in my opinion, his biggest accomplishment as president. And to see that shift happen didn't happen from one great man to another. It happened from people at the grassroots pushing it. And so all of these issues, when we maybe pay attention when the great man or woman finally deals with it, but I really do think the engine that drives this really comes from the bottom up.
I mean, the most effective leaders, in my opinion, exploit when that moment has emerged. And I've become more appreciative of this as I developed as a scholar. But Schlafly alone doesn't create conservatism, but she can see what's happening in the electorate. She can see the organizational opportunities that emerged. Newt Gingrich, who I talked about and I'm writing about, he's similar. He doesn't create modern conservatism. It's not just because of him that you see the party change. It's because he's so astute at what's happening in the world of news media and in congressional politics that he sees those opportunities have emerged. I wrote about Lyndon Johnson. It was the same thing. So I think the two are not these binary categories. And to answer both is actually to understand why the great people are effective, great for whatever reason. It's not in isolation. Then you miss why they are able to change the direction of events.
Go ahead.
We've been talking about the history, our national history of divisiveness, where that came from, and just in 2016, we had a lot of speculation about foreign interference and inflaming national divisiveness from that. And how vulnerable do you think we are from moving forward with foreign interference and inflaming this type of political approach?
Well, as I like to say, if you saw the earlier event, I said this there too. I'm an historian. My training's in hindsight, so it's tough to make predictions. I'm also not an expert on this, so I can only go by. But Robert Mueller and the head of the FBI and all the national security people and national intelligence folks say it's currently a big issue. So unless something is done to address it, I have to assume it'll remain a big problem.
And you'd have to assume that, because the way what is being exploited works, it already, without Russian interference, is already incredibly divisive. So it was so easy for some Russian hackers to throw information into this ecosystem and to be successful, because that's how our institutions are working. They will work like that in 220, they will work like that in 224, and they're going to work like that for a while. So that means we're incredibly vulnerable. And unless the government is taking extraordinary steps to really prevent this, you have to assume it's happening as we speak.
So on Twitter, you guys do something that all of us wish we could do as well as you do. You fight back, but it's pretty passive. It's maybe not having that much effect, except on your choir. And so I'm curious to know, historians, what can we do to change this history?
I think we're starting to see the roots of it. One of the silver linings of this moment we're in is that I think a lot of Americans have started to stop taking their politics for granted. For a long time, this country was on autopilot. In the 90s and the 2000s even, a lot of people thought of politics as something out there. And it was national, and you think about the president and maybe Congress, and that's about it. And maybe as a good citizen, you get out and you vote every 4 years. Maybe the really good ones get out and vote every 2 years. What we're seeing now is a real awakening. I think people have stopped taking democracy for granted and are getting involved themselves, running for office themselves. The important ones, I think, are local and state ones, and people are starting to step up and move for those, or working on campaigns for those, getting involved in social movements, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the Women's March, the March for Our Lives after Parkland. These problems clearly aren't going to go away if they're left solely to the great men in D.C., right? They need that social movement from below to push them to demand accountability and to say either you act on this or we'll vote you out and replace you with someone who will. So that is something I think we can all do to get involved, to get off the bench and get in there. Whether you're going to run for something yourself or work on a campaign yourself or get invested in a cause, pick something you care about that you think is going to get changed, because the problem I run into with students is they're constantly thinking about, well, where's the next great person going to come from? Let's wait for them. They're going to be here any minute now. I wonder who the next Martin Luther King is going to be. They never think that it's going to be them. The thing I end my lecture course with, and having to kind of counteract some of that great man theory, is to remind these students that all these people that they heard about, they weren't great when they started, right? And they started young. Okay, not to dissuade the older folks in the audience, but what I'm talking to a room of college students when I do this, and I point out, when Martin Luther King launched the Montgomery bus boycott, he was 25. Okay? When Gordon Hirabayashi violated the curfew against Japanese Americans, he was a senior in college. When Tom Hayden founded SDS, the organization that challenged the Vietnam War, he was a junior in college. Those 4 young men who sat in at Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, they were freshmen. Okay, high school kids have changed this nation, right? From the students who desegregated Little Rock Central High School to a young woman named Lillian Gobitis who went to the Supreme Court when she was 9. And they weren't great men or women when they did that stuff, okay? They became great because they did that. And they didn't wait for someone great to come along and do it. So the lesson here, I think, that I give to them, and I hope I can give to you, is that don't wait for the great men. Be that greatness yourself. Because that's how it happens.
If I could jump in, I think, the fighting back, there's a clap. We're both professors, and so our primary mission is intellectual life and the world of ideas, and trying to promote debate that's based on facts and reason and smart analysis. We each do this in another world as well, in Twitter, television. We do our best. If that fighting back isn't kind of one side versus the other, it's an effort to bring back sound, reasonable discussions to political questions. And in addition, in addition to the kind of idea of where's the next great activist coming from, I'm a big believer forums like this, podcasts like what you do. These are the platforms that are needed. And I don't know when you win or lose. It might be not in our lifetime. But the more people that are promoting events like this, where you have these kinds of discussions in a church, in a school, in a library, online, on television, wherever you can inject some kind of debate about the big questions of our time, that's a contribution. And those contributions are valuable. They're hard to do because the payoff isn't always immediate. But I think that's what we need more than anything. And so when Kevin's answering, I'm looking at the room, and I'm like, boy, this is a great event. This is exactly what we need.
So as a sociologist, I also feel like I should make a small plug for sociology and say, if you want to understand social change, also read sociology. So unfortunately, we can't take any more questions, but thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode and you enjoy the show in general, please leave us a review on iTunes because it helps other people find out about the show. My next episode will feature Charlie Sykes, former conservative radio talk show host and current host of the Bulwark podcast. You can reach me at podcast@heterodoxacademy.org or on Twitter at ChrisMartin76.
This podcast is produced by Heterodox Academy. Find us online at heterodoxacademy.org, on Twitter at HDX Academy, and on Facebook.